Chapter 7. Towards the Tories. On the morrow of Gladstone's historic oration moving for leave to bring in a bill to amend the provision for the future government of Ireland, Chamberlain was made what was in effect his resignation speech. It was not a success as a speech, and at several points he found himself caught in embarrassments which suggest that for some reason he was ill-prepared. But it won the continued plaudits of the Tory party. He retorted upon those who argued that coercion was the only alternative to such proposals as Gladstone's, that these too would have to be imposed by coercion upon the Protestant population, prosperous and industrious and enterprising, constituting at least 1/5 of the population of an island comprising not a homogeneous community, but 2 nations, 2 races, and 2 religions. On the other hand, he recognized that the proposals had rendered obsolete his past projects of local government and national councils, and he pointed once more to a federal United Kingdom as the only means of satisfying the essential requirement of Irish representation in the Imperial Parliament. He even referred to the existence between the colonies and this country of a general desire to draw tighter the bonds which unite us and to bring the whole empire into one federation, the illusion which was to haunt his mind and dog his steps for the remainder of his life. But in subsequent debate he writhed under the jibes of those who pointed out that the radical programme had dismissed federation as outside the range of practical politics because it would involve so great a disturbance of the English constitution. Chamberlain had evidently pondered the meaning of federation deeply. An article, A Radical View of the Irish Crisis, in the Fortnightly Review of February 1886, the authorship of which he never disavowed, proved this. In particular, he understood that, by involving a written fundamental constitution, federation was incompatible with the continuance of the prescriptive elements, the hereditary House of Lords, and above all the monarchy. It is hardly conceivable that even the nominal authority of the Crown could be long preserved. He quoted. The conclusion was dismal. The scheme involves the absolute destruction of the historical constitution of the United Kingdom, the creation of a tabula rasa, and the establishment thereupon of the United States Constitution in all its details. According to this precedent, Ireland might have 1 or even 2 local legislatures, if Ulster preferred to retain a separate independence. Scotland and Wales would each have another, and England would also have a parliament and a ministry of its own. There would be, overall, an imperial parliament, charged entirely with the control of foreign and colonial affairs, military and naval expenditure, and customs and post office. It may be that such a proposal would not be seriously objected to by consistent radicals, and it is probable that it would work without friction and preserve a real union of the empire for defensive and offensive purposes. But it is hardly conceivable that the people of Great Britain as a whole are prepared for such a violent and complete revolution. With such a bleak conclusion, advocating in practice no more than radical land reform in the forlorn hope of undermining Parnell's ascendancy, was Chamberlain to go out into the cold against Gladstone's bill. Stripped to its essential, his motive was the instinctual defence of the historical unitary constitution. He was a Unionist. Knowing the destructive logical implications of continued representation of Ireland in Parliament, Chamberlain proceeded nevertheless to make that his condition for allowing a second reading to the bill, because he foresaw that it would involve committee demands for a separate assembly for Ulster, complete subordination of the Irish assemblies to the Imperial Parliament, the power to deal only with the subjects expressly referred to them, and the reversal of financial arrangements so that a mere block grant was paid over to the devolved administrations. It was the same test which divided the Liberal Party in the country. On 21st of April, Chamberlain's 2000, the Birmingham caucus, passed a resolution demanding that the Irish members shall be retained at Westminster. When this was defeated in the National Caucus on the 5th of May, the headquarters of the National Liberal Federation was moved to London, and a new Liberal Unionist Association was formed. Faced with the prospect of some 90 Liberal defections, Gladstone wobbled and equivocated to the last moment. Then he moved the second reading on the 10th of May, offering no more than to give an unprejudiced ear in committee to proposals which others may make for the purpose of ensuring the continued manifestation of common interest between Great Britain and Ireland in imperial concerns. He had previously cited giving Irish members an opportunity of appearing in the House to take a share in the transaction of an alteration in customs and excise. Once more, as the debate wore on, the old master tried the trick of riding two horses at once. One day he suggested to a Liberal Party meeting that the bill, if read a second time, could be withdrawn and introduced recast, only to repudiate any such notion on the floor of the House the next day. In the division, which took place after the 12th day of debate on the 7th of June, 93 Liberals voted against Gladstone and the bill, which was defeated by 30. John Bright, who was openly opposed both to Home Rule and to Federation, voted against, and his letter intimating that he would do so was believed to have been a potent influence on the Radicals. Gladstone dissolved. The election which followed gave the Conservatives a majority of 118, but 74 of those were Liberal Unionists, roughly half and half, Whig and Radical. The balance had departed from Parnell forever, from the Irish Nationalists for a quarter of a century, and was now held by the Liberal Unionists. A fact which Lord Salisbury shrewdly recognised by advising the Queen to send for Lord Hartington, who declined. This is a situation in which the jailer easily becomes the prisoner of his charges. There is nothing like keeping another political party in office by one's votes, for giving one a sympathetic and almost protective understanding of their character and motives. After all, from division to division, one is responsible for their remaining in office, and unless they are speedily to be turned out, one needs to defend the measures which they propose, and for which, tacitly or formally, they must have reasonably assured themselves of one's support. It might appear that the Liberal Unionists could as easily gravitate back to their Liberal matrix. In reality, there was no such freedom of choice. Only those incompatible to the core with Conservative ministers, who found themselves almost accidentally in the Unionist boat, would peel off and rejoin Gladstone. For Chamberlain by now, and, had he known it, long before, there was no such incompatibility. In vain did the Liberal Unionist Privy Councillors persist in sitting in the opposition front bench with the Gladstonians. In vain did Chamberlain advise Hartington that our real policy is never to vote with the Tories unless they are in danger, and to vote against them whenever we can safely do so, as he wrote on the 9th of September 1886. The nub of the matter was in his words in the confidence debate on the Queen's speech. I shall do nothing to turn out the government so long as the government which would take its place is committed to a separatist policy. That would be, in effect, for the rest of his lifetime. A brief episode at the end of 1886 provided corroboration. A combination of the Christmas spirit and of Lord Randolph Churchill's Lucifer-like resignation as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which seemed to portend an incompatibly reactionary Conservative stance, led to 3 round-table meetings between Chamberlain, Trevelyan, Morley, Harcourt, Herschel and Fowler, with Gladstone's knowledge, if not approval. They served only to reaffirm Chamberlain's immovable insistence on the Home Rule all round, or none at all, and on separate treatment of Ulster or part of Ulster. His belief expressed in a Christmas speech at Birmingham that without solving the land question, Home Rule is impossible, and I believe that if you solve it, Home Rule will be unnecessary, was as stubborn as it was purblind. The Round Table ended in public recrimination. In the session of 1887, the Liberal Unionists supported Conservative coercion measures in Ireland, but Chamberlain's pressure secured not only an allotments bill with compulsory powers, but an Irish land bill providing against Conservative instincts for the reassessment and reduction of rents already judicially assessed. Even so, there was a near disaster at the end of the session when the government declared membership of the Irish National League to be criminal. Of 69 Liberal Unionists, 47 under Hartington voted with the government, 5, with Chamberlain among them, against, and 17 abstained. At about the same time, Chamberlain came to the conclusion that his firmly held federal solution for Ireland was on both sides a non-starter and undertook to Hartington to consign it to silence henceforward. he was speaking that summer in Birmingham when the following sentences escaped him. "We shall be taunted, I suppose, with an alliance with the Tories. At least our allies will be English gentlemen. There is no surer guide to what is happening now, below the surface, perhaps below the surface of consciousness, than words struck out in anger." Meantime, two great political lubricants were applied: time and patronage. The week after Chamberlain's vote against the government, Salisbury offered him the post of Chief Commissioner in the United States for the settlement of the fishery dispute between the two countries. He accepted immediately. In the 3 months, November 1887 to February 1888, were negotiated a treaty, repudiated after the following presidential election, and a provisional protocol which lasted, controlling the access of New England fishermen to Canadian territorial waters. But a speech which Chamberlain made in Toronto was more important. "It may yet be," he declared, "that the Federation of Canada may be the lamp lighting our path to the Federation of the British Empire. It is an idea to stimulate the patriotism and statesmanship of every man who loves his country." The note was not new. The instance of Canada had been invoked by Federalists in the Home Rule conflict of 1885 to 86, and imperial federation had been mentioned more than once. But at Chamberlain's point of transition from an old life to a new one, it was understandable if the will-o'-the-wisp of a federal United Kingdom was magnified and transformed into the Brocken spectre of a federal worldwide empire. The newness of Chamberlain's life thereafter was sealed by his third marriage. Before he left America, he had become engaged, secretly until after the presidential elections, to a girl of 24, less than half his age, a Miss Mary Endicott, daughter of the Secretary of War, and a descendant of a governor of Massachusetts, who had excised the cross of St. George from the flag with his own hand. He returned to America to marry her at the end of the year, and brought her to Highbury for Christmas 1888. The GCB was offered and declined, but the Freedom of Birmingham accepted, an occasion for Bright's last public speech, in which he described Imperial Federation as a dream and an absurdity, words which provoked Chamberlain to enter into a little detail shortly after. "We should seek and find a concerted system of defence. The difficulty in the case of commercial union is much greater. It is hardly to be hoped that the protected interests fostered by their system will willingly surrender the privileges which now they enjoy. All we can do is to wait until proposals are made to us, and they will accept them if they do not involve the sacrifice of any important principle or of any interest vital to our population. However veiled the language, there is no mistaking the meaning. This is not federation. This is customs union at the outside, but mutual protection or fair trade at the minimum." The political yeast of Chamberlain's situation, as at once the patron and prisoner of the Conservative government which he kept in office, worked with steadily increasing vigour as the life of the 1886 Parliament lengthened. When the general election came, it would be later rather than sooner, with the by-elections going, as they did, consistently and sometimes disastrously against the government. On whose side would he fight? At a general election, now the commitment must be unambiguous and could not, as in 1886, be subsumed under a single subject. Such a prospect cast its shadow far before. In Birmingham in 1888, new-made Birmingham Liberal Unionist Association had to replace and partly cannibalise the old Liberal caucus against the day when it would be needed to ensure what? That no Gladstonian Liberal would be returned for a Birmingham constituency? Municipal or parliamentary? Some of the candidates would be Conservatives. One of the members, H. Matthews in Birmingham East, was a Conservative already. And why should not the electors, and as many as possible, be Tories? Of the Tory democracy which Lord Randolph Churchill had once proclaimed in Birmingham itself. Gone were the days of Chamberlain cared to delight an audience by declaring that if a genuine Conservative working man could be found, he ought to be stuffed and preserved in a glass case like a unique zoological specimen. When the day of reckoning came, Chamberlain had to be able to show that the Conservative Party, which he would seek to retain in office, was by record, as well as programme, reasonably consistent with the causes with which he had always been identified. Indeed, was arguably more so than Gladstone had proved. In every session after 1887, Chamberlain could note steady, though not unqualified, progression towards that necessary objective. In 1888, the Conservative government elected county councils in Great Britain. Chamberlain was able to secure that they contained no non-elective element, though he could not insist on the simultaneous application of the same measure to Ireland, nor on the simultaneous creation of elective district and parish councils, nor on full control by the county councils over the police. Still, it was a great measure, and one which had eluded Liberal governments. The year 1889 was an annus mirabilis of screeching crises, which lifted the Home Rulers up to the skies and dashed them down again. Since April 1887, Parnell had lived under the cloud of the publication by the Times of letters purporting to be in his handwriting condoning the Phoenix Park murders of 1882. Parnellism and crime was the celebrated headline. In February 1889, a judicial commission exposed the letters as forgeries. Pigott, the forger, fled to Madrid and committed suicide there, and Parnell was the hero of the day. On Christmas Eve 1889, O'Shea filed a petition for divorce and cited Parnell as co-respondent. A year later, in November 1890, the undefended case was heard and the Irish party, which Parnell had led, disowned him, to die only a few months after in Mrs. O'Shea's arms. A.J. Balfour, as Chief Secretary, had set himself to match coercion with a series of measures, in accordance with Chamberlain's diagnosis, to transform the agrarian condition of Ireland. These began to come to fruition in 1889 and 1890, with the programmes of public works and a Land Purchase Act, though not yet accompanied, as Chamberlain would have wished, by elective local government responsible for its administration. The decisive step, however, was in 1891, when Goshen's budget provided for free education both in board schools and denomination schools. Chamberlain had gained his point of 20 years before, though at the price of accepting and defending as permanent the so-called dual system of secular and denominational schools side by side. As for disestablishment, he was content firmly to treat that item of the radical creed as a dead duck. For the rest, he could claim that, with a Small Holdings Act, embodying compulsory powers in the final pre-election session of 1892, the inspiration and support of the Liberal Unionism had secured from the Tory party the acceptance and substantial realisation of the programme for which, to Gladstone's discomfort, he had contended as a radical ex-cabinet minister at the fateful election of 1885. In 1891, a joint conference of Liberal Unionists and Conservatives met in Birmingham Town Hall, and when Lord Salisbury attended the Conservative National Conference in that same town hall in November, Chamberlain sat by his side and proposed the toast of the Unionist cause. "I neither look for nor desire," he said, "reunion with the Liberal party." The transition was complete. When Hartington at last became Duke of Devonshire a few days later, his successor as Liberal Unionist leader, unanimously, as he insisted, acknowledged, was Joseph Chamberlain. With an election now in the offing, Chamberlain began to prepare a mirror image of the campaign of 1885, whereby his speeches would provide his Conservative allies and his Whig allies in the Liberal Unionist party with a radical programme, whether they liked it or not, fit to match or overtrump the Newcastle programme produced in October 1891 by the Liberal caucus. In March 1891, he had launched the proposal for contributory old age pensions on the German model, and the unofficial parliamentary committee set up to elaborate it came out in May 1892 with a scheme for 5 shillings a week at 65. In the campaign itself, he used his well-tried method of a series of previously prepared speeches, adding up to a programme which could be discharged on successive days, including in this list workmen's compensation, district and parish councils, limitation of working hours, and courts of arbitration. As the polling began, the Ulster Covenant of 17th of June in Belfast, organised preponderantly by Liberal Unionists, conveyed the evidence to all who cared to see it that if Home Rule were enacted, either the major part of Ulster must have separate treatment, or it would be the signal for civil war. Chamberlain promptly raised the theme of Ulster to a central position in his warnings against Home Rule. Immediately after the election had been fought and lost, Balfour presciently summed up Chamberlain's position for Salisbury as follows. He feels it to be absolutely necessary for his own position and for that of his party to be able to appeal to a substantive programme of social legislation. He is ready and anxious to frame his programme on conservative lines. He would rather like, if he saw his way, to unite with us and to sit with us under the common denomination of a national party. Chapter 8. A Unionist. The Parliament that was elected in June 1892 and the government that took office in consequence in August were not merely in retrospect fated to failure and early extinction. They were conscious in advance of their doom to a degree which has rarely, if ever, been paralleled. Gladstone had a majority of 40, but that was only after including the Irish Home Rulers. He would be again, and more strictly than in 1886, their prisoner. On the other side of the Liberal Unionists numbered 47, but they were no longer, as in Parliament just dissolved, held the balance, or only in the wild hypothesis that the Liberal Party could lose the Irish but get back the Unionists in exchange. It was an unrealistic might have been, but it enabled Chamberlain and the Liberal Unionists to claim that Gladstone had driven the Liberal Party to sacrifice all its other historic aims to the dream of solving the Irish question, a dream predictably unreasonable with a majority so narrow. When Parliament resumed in 1893, Chamberlain sat no longer, as heretofore, on the Liberal front bench. In fact, the Liberal Unionists offered to change places with the Irish Nationalists and go over to the Conservative benches on the opposition side. But that was too much for the Nationalists to stomach, and the Liberal Unionists remained on the Liberal side, but below the gangway, with Chamberlain now occupying the classic strategic post at the top of the third bench. It was from this distance that he fought his duel with Gladstone over the Home Rule Bill, of which the first reading was moved on the 13th of February. At its heart lay the old unsolved, because insoluble, dilemma. How, given self-government, was Ireland to be represented in the House of Commons? In 1886, Gladstone had given the impossible answer, not at all. This time he preferred another of the impossible answers, and proposed that Ireland should continue to be represented in the House of Commons on the same ratio of members to population as Great Britain, but that the Irish members should be debarred from voting on questions which concerned Great Britain only. The clause was known derisively as the in and out clause. An antagonistic, less versed than Chamberlain in all the permutations and combinations of the Home Rule conundrum would have been bound to shoot so impracticable a proposition to pieces with broadsides of ridicule. It was in the course of the debate on the second reading that an incident occurred long remembered in parliamentary annals. Gladstone, in winding up, took occasion to congratulate Chamberlain upon the maiden speech he delivered in that debate by his son Austin, returned unopposed for East Worcestershire at a by-election near the end of the last Parliament. It was, the grand old man said, a speech which must have been dear and refreshing to a father's heart. The House observed that Chamberlain momentarily failed to conceal his emotion. Gladstone had touched a spring which opened one of the secret chambers of Chamberlain's life, for the flint-like, cold demeanour which struck all observers was sustained by an intensely warm family life of mutual dependence and devotion. The Chamberlains were a clan, in the least derogatory sense of the word. Their family loyalties were total, and rendered them emotionally and self-sufficient on the exterior. Into this closed world Chamberlain's third wife was wholly adopted after 3 years of widowerhood, across which his deep and lasting affection for his children, and above all for Austin, had helped to carry him on. By By the end of June, only 4 clauses of the bill had been dealt with in committee, and the remainder was subjected to a guillotine which secured its passage by a majority of 34 on the 2nd of September. On the way, however, the indefensible in and out clause had been dropped, leaving the position, which the advocates of the bill in commending that clause had already declared to be indefensible, that 80 Irish members would vote upon all matters whatsoever. The effect of this volte-face was to expose, and not only to its opponents, the unworkability of the bill, with the result that the House of Lords was able summarily and massively to reject it without arousing any serious public revulsion. The circumstances, therefore, in which the Lords might feel constrained to pass the bill but attached it to the requirement of a referendum, which in February Chamberlain had proposed to Salisbury and Salisbury had favoured, did not arise. The session was preternaturally prolonged, in the hope that the Lords would massacre the government's other measures and thus enable the Home Rule issue to be merged into that of the peers versus the people. An outcome avoided by management in which Chamberlain was deeply involved both behind and in front of the scenes. Gladstone was brought to recognise that even his last hope of carrying Home Rule, dissolution and a renewed appeal of the electorate, had no reality, and he resigned on the 1st of March 1894, in his 86th year. Lord Rosebery succeeded to the inheritance of a government which the Irish nationalists no longer had any necessity to provide with a reliable majority, a cabinet intensely divided, and a party which, in the election that must soon come, could neither fight for Home Rule nor disavow it, and was left with the unconvincing and embarrassing cry of ending or mending the House of Lords. As the prospect of the return of a Conservative government became more imminent, the ambiguity of Chamberlain's position became more unmanageable. For the third time, the Conservative Party would be put under the strain which tests all coalitions of guaranteeing the existing seats of their allies, and allocating to them further seats still held by the enemy. After twice achieving the destruction of Home Rule and a Liberal government, it was difficult to imagine how Chamberlain could now be otherwise than a leading member of the new administration. If so, however, he must share collective responsibility for the policy of a Conservative government, and yet could not, without destroying his own moral position and alienating the ex-Liberal votes on which his party and his allies depended, disavow his essential radicalism. The problem was solved, though only just, by effectively identifying Unionism and Conservatism. "I am," said Chamberlain at Birmingham in January 1894, "and shall be in the future, proud to call myself a Unionist, and be satisfied with that title alone, believing it is a wider and nobler title than that either of Conservative or Liberal, since it includes them both, since it includes all men who are determined to maintain an undivided empire, and who are ready to promote the welfare and the union, not of one class, but of all the classes of the community." This, then, was the plan, its essence contained in the meaning the United Kingdom or the British Empire, and the ambiguity of union meaning political union or social solidarity. After all, had not Chamberlain discovered that in social questions the Conservatives have always been more progressive than the Liberals? In another Birmingham speech later in 1894, in which all his radical enthusiasms, old and new, from public managements of the drink trade to universal workmen's compensation, were marshalled, he wove both utilitarianism and imperialism together into the new pattern. "We may fairly call upon the government to use its vast resources and its great influence to secure the greatest happiness of the greatest number. British employment, restricted more and more by foreign tariffs, would expand with the empire. Let prosperity and power advance together, each force helping the other." Nevertheless, the stresses mounted to a climax in the spring of 1895. Bitter attacks were made from within the Conservative Party as well as from among associates of earlier years upon this Unionist, who voted for Welsh disestablishment, and who was once again engaged, as yet a third election appeared on the horizon, in hanging a radical programme around the Conservative neck. A furious quarrel broke out in the West Midlands over the allocation of candidatures, which only the combined efforts of Salisbury and of Balfour, who led the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, in close personal league with Chamberlain, were able to allay. The political crisis coincided with the collapse in Chamberlain's financial fortunes, due to severe decline after 1890 in South American securities, followed by the disastrous investment in a sizable growing enterprise on the Bahamian island of Andros, which his younger son Neville was sent out to manage. In letters to his wife, the sincerity of which cannot be doubted, Chamberlain felt that he was on the verge of leaving public life. The simple fact is that work which has sustained me during the last 8 years has been, for the time at any rate, accomplished. I have largely assisted to make Home Rule impossible. The spell passed even more suddenly than it came. On 14th of June, 1895, Chamberlain was on the conference platform of the National Union of Conservative Associations in London. A week later, Rosebery took the occasion of a snap defeat on an unimportant Commons question to resign, and Salisbury assumed office with Chamberlain in his cabinet. Dissolution followed immediately, and the government was confirmed in office for over 10 years, as it turned out, by a majority of 152. The Liberal Unionists numbered 70, not quite holding the balance. Chamberlain had completed the perilous Middle Passage. With Balfour, he was the greatest power on the government side in the Commons, in the strongest administration since 1832. The transition had been assisted, indeed perhaps made possible, by a change in the background of the political scene, which may, if it is to be dated, have commenced with the London Docks Strike of 1889. It was the rise of socialism, characterized by the Marxist resolutions of the Trades Union Congress in 1893 and 1894, the Progressive Party's policies on the London County Council, and the election in 1892 of Kerr Hardy as independent Labour member for South West Ham. To Chamberlain, these were the New Radicals, whose object is to merge the individual in the state, to reduce all to one dead level of uniformity, in which the inefficient, the thriftless, and the idle are to be confounded and treated alike with the honest and the industrious and the capable. That's from a speech in Leeds dated February 1894. This was straightforward Conservative stuff, and Chamberlain knew it. As he wrote to the Duke of Devonshire in November 1894, the policy of the Gladstonian leaders has been to invite popular pressure in order that they might yield to it, and there is grave danger to anticipate that they will yield to the demands of the new trade unionism. The Independent Labour Party are proceeding on this assumption. They direct their attacks upon the Gladstonians and avow that they will treat them as enemies until they have accepted the socialist programme. It seems to me obvious that this will be their ultimate fate, but in doing so they will risk a further secession of all that remains of them of wealth, intelligence and moderation. It was the tide of that secession which helped to bear the Liberal Unionists in general, and Chamberlain in particular, safe into the haven of unionism. On the other hand, the Chamberlainite secession was at least one of the causes which condemned the Liberal Party to eventual extinction at the hands of Labour. A Liberal Party led by the pre-1886 Chamberlain might have gained acceptance as a vehicle for trade unionism, and even for socialism. Certainly it would have become a party of the working class candidate. With the departure of Chamberlainites, it was condemned to become the party of Asquith. Chapter 9. Colonial Secretary. When Salisbury's cabinet was announced in June 1895, there was widespread surprise that the office allotted to Joseph Chamberlain was Secretary of State for the Colonies, albeit that office was much more prestigious than as the generations now alive remember it. Though it was assumed correctly that he must have asked for it, the fact was not then known that it was the office for which he had asked Gladstone in 1886, only to be repulsed with the cutting ejaculation, "Oh, a Secretary of State!" It was one of whose fixed determination it was to be one day, in effect, Minister for the British Empire, India only excepted. that Chamberlain had lived through the intervening 8 years and a half, and experienced that widening of his horizons and deepening of his imperialism which made him the type and spokesman of the prevalent mood of Britain in the decades immediately before and after the end of Queen Victoria's reign. Visiting Turkey in November 1886, he had pressed upon the Sultan a scheme of British-built railways in the Ottoman Empire to link with the Indian system, as that in turn would link with the system in China, something in which he had sought to interest colleagues in the few weeks that he remained in Gladstone's 1886 government. At the end of 1887, responding in Toronto to the toast of the commercial interests of the empire, he expounded the heady theme that "I should think our patriotism was warped and stunted indeed if it did not embrace the Greater Britain beyond the seas." He went on to touch the federal chord of the Irish debates again. "It may yet be that the Federation of Canada may be the lamp lighting our path to the Federation of the British Empire. If it is a dream, it may be only the imagination of an enthusiast. It is a grand idea. And whether it be destined or not to perfect realization, at least let us all cherish the sentiments it inspires." Chamberlain's imperialism was already economic as well as constitutional. "Is there any man in his senses," he asked the London Chamber of Commerce in May 1888, "who believes that the crowd population of these islands could exist for a single day if we were to cut adrift from the great dependencies which now look to us for protection and which are the natural markets for our trade?" It is a fascinating sentence, for its reference to protection and to markets prefigures the use of defence and preference as means at any rate to an imperfect realisation of that federal dream which Chamberlain was hard-headed enough to mistrust in its literal interpretation. In the same speech to the London Chamber of Commerce, he inquired, "Who is to be a dominant power in Africa?" And indeed the logic of his argument thus stated pointed not only to the retention of empire but to expansion. In Birmingham in January 1889, he was referring with approval to the constant growth and expansion of our empire, and he was instrumental in the June of that year in the dismissal of Sir Hercules Robinson, who, as High Commissioner and Cape Governor, was resolutely opposing imperial expansion in South Africa. It was, however, Chamberlain's Egyptian visit at the end of 1889, Joseph in Egypt, which most evidently strengthened and stimulated his imperial thinking. In December he was writing, "If the English occupation is maintained, I have no doubt as to the future of Egypt. I hope we shall stay." By March 1890 it had become, "We have got to stay in Egypt for an indefinite time." In Egypt too he decided with Kitchener that Sudan would have to be reconquered by Britain. A free hand for Britain in Africa was his motive in search, with Clemenceau in 1891, for, anticipatory phrase, an entente cordiale with France. Meanwhile there had occurred in May 1890 the curious episode of his conversation with the Canadian apostle of imperial preference, Colonel Denison, according to whose later recollection Chamberlain concluded, "I shall study the whole question of reciprocal preference thoroughly for myself, and if and after full consideration I come to the conclusion that this policy will be in the interests of the country and the empire, I shall take it up and advocate it." Adding, "Do not tell a soul that I ever said I could think of such a thing. In the present condition of opinion in England, it would never do." The political events of the early 1890s afforded less leisure or opportunity for the further development of Chamberlain's imperial philosophy, but in his early months in office in 1895 he already had familiar themes that surrounded and sounded in familiar tones. At a celebration of the completion of the Durban-Johannesburg Railway in November 1895, he repeated that, "I am told on every hand that imperial federation is a vain and empty dream," but added that dreams of that kind have somehow or other an unaccountable way of being realized in their time, and in the same month he called for a report from all the colonies on the extent to which foreign imports have displaced or are displacing similar British goods, and also on colonial products which do not at present find a sufficient market in the United Kingdom. Before he could develop these ideas, South Africa swept everything else aside. In August 1895, Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape and Chairman of the British South Africa Company, demanded the transfer of the company of the Buchananland Protectorate, in order to enable a railway to be built through it from Mafeking to Bulawayo, which would run along the Transvaal border. Simultaneously, Kruger, the Transvaal president, having now his railway communication with Portuguese Delagoa proceeded to penalise or prevent the entry of goods from the Cape. By November, Chamberlain had agreed to grant Rhodes a Buchananland corridor controlled by his company's own police, and an ultimatum from Britain that forced Kruger to climb down and lift the restrictions on Cape goods. Chamberlain, however, had become convinced that an insurrection by the disenfranchised and heavily taxed British and other aliens, the Uitlanders, in Johannesburg was imminent, and he shared the prevalent belief that it would overthrow Kruger and establish a new state. On the 6th of December, the High Commissioner, once again the now septuagenarian Sir Hercules Robinson, was ordered by Chamberlain, as soon as the insurrection should occur, to move in and take control of events, with a view to the new state accepting British allegiance and thus opening the way to a South African federation. Chamberlain was aware that the company's Buchananland corridor would, in those circumstances, afford a ready springboard for intervention in the Transvaal, and that in January 2 troop ships would conveniently be in the vicinity of the Cape. He did not apparently inform the Prime Minister of these arrangements until the 26th of December, when he sent him a letter commencing, "I have received private information that a rising in Johannesburg is imminent and will take place in the course of the next few days," and ending, "If the rising is successful, it ought to turn to our advantage." In fact, he had been deep in communication through Colonial Office officials and their unofficial contacts with Rhodes and others in the Cape who were counting on the revolt, and was aware that a force under a Dr. Jameson was in readiness to dash to Johannesburg immediately should the revolt break out. Catastrophe struck when the would-be rebels in Johannesburg got cold feet before Christmas, and Dr. Jameson nevertheless plunged into Transvaal against Rhodes's orders on the 29th of December, only to be rounded up and captured on the 2nd of January. On imperfect rumours of Jameson's intentions, Chamberlain wired the High Commissioner on the 29th of December to deter Rhodes peremptorily, and on confirmation he followed this up on the 31st of December by an injunction of total disavowal. Significantly, he wrote that day to the Prime Minister, "It is worth noting that I have no confidence that the force now sent, with its allies in Johannesburg, is strong enough to beat the Boers." Chamberlain, as reference in the dispatches prove, knew about everything included in the raid, except, of course, that it would take place despite the rebellion not occurring. He had kept clear only of active involvement. The responsibility, he minuted on 18th of December to his permanent secretary, must rest with Rhodes, and we had better abstain from giving even advice. "There is nothing more to be done," he informed Salisbury on Boxing Day, when he still believed the rebellion imminent, "than to watch the event, which we have done nothing to provoke." The prize of a hostile republic converted into a British colony in a future federal South Africa had tempted the Colonial Secretary to the very verge of encouraging and over the verge of condoning armed rebellion, provided it were successful, in a state for whose external relations Britain herself asserted responsibility. Having been unlucky, Chamberlain was immediately lucky. The telegram of congratulation which the Kaiser dispatched to Kruger on the 3rd of January raised a surge of patriotic fury not only in Britain but in Canada and Australia, to which Chamberlain responded by a bold reference to this League of Kindred Nations, this Federation of Greater Britain, and which enabled him to turn the blame upon Kruger, whom the High Commissioner was instructed to warn that the state of things of which complaint is made cannot continue forever, and that Great Britain will resist at all costs the interference of any foreign power. It was evident, however, that there must be inquiry, all the more so because Rhodes's agent began to spread rumours of undisclosed but incriminating documents, and in July 1896, as soon as Dr. Jameson's trial was over, Chamberlain moved for a select committee, which took evidence from February to July 1897. To the discredit of Harcourt and Campbell Bannerman, who were the opposition members of the committee, it reached the astonishing conclusion that Rhodes was guilty of grave breaches of duty, but that neither the Colonial Secretary nor any of his officials received any information which made them, or should have made them, aware of the plot during its development. A statement incompatible with the evidence before them, whether plot referred to the rebellion in Johannesburg or to Jameson's readiness to support it. In the debate upon the report on the 27th of July, Chamberlain actually exposed this inconsistency by going out of his way to laud and defend Rhodes as having marred transcendent services to the empire only by one gigantic error. Since Rhodes had no more authorised or expected Jameson's lone fling than had Chamberlain, there was no error of Rhodes to which Chamberlain had not been privy. The passage was so incredible as to raise the question whether Rhodes had some hold upon Chamberlain after all, but by now the Diamond Jubilee had come and gone, absorbing and overshadowing everything else. For the Colonial Secretary, its significance lay in the outcome of the conference, of the then 11 premiers of Canada and the other self-governing and still unfederated colonies. During 1896, Chamberlain had explored in speeches the concept of imperial Zollverein, an empire of internal free trade, revenue duties apart, which protected tariffs against the rest of the world. It would imply, since the external tariffs must in principle be uniform, a common political organ or imperial council in which Chamberlain was fain to discern the germ of federation. The Imperial Conference exploded any such notion. In common with the Colonial Conference of 10 years earlier and the Ottawa Conference of 1894, the premiers made it clear that the colonies would not abandon their attachment to high protection. What they would do, however, was to offer the mother country a less steep tariff barrier than they presented to the rest of the world. And in fact, Canada already taken the initiative in April by enacting a 12.5% preference for Britain with the prospect of increasing it to 25%. Chamberlain seized the substitute half loaf with both hands, recording that the conference had to a certain extent approved the proposals of those colonies which have protective duty should be asked to consider whether they would not follow the example of Canada and give a preferential advantage to the mother country. Britain for her part, forthwith cleared the way by denouncing treaties with Germany and Belgium, which gave those countries, and thus via most favoured nations clauses, other countries too, the right to the same terms of trade within the empire as Britain enjoyed herself. Still, it could not escape the notice of Chamberlain that in giving Britain preference, the colonies were giving something more for nothing, or at any rate for nothing material. Britain could not encourage and promote their action by offering preferences in return, so long at least as she herself adhered to free trade. A system of one-way preferences would have no federal implications, but political union received, especially from Canada's Liberal Prime Minister Laurier, a curious and in retrospect ominous airing. In his opening address, Chamberlain had asked if it was feasible to create a great council of the empire to which the colonies would send representative plenipotentiaries, not mere delegates, and this might slowly grow to that federal council to which we must always look forward as our ultimate ideal. It would be a good thing, responded Laurier, for the colonies to be represented on the floor of Parliament, by representatives allowed as full-fledged members the right to speak and not to vote. But the sting was in the tail. This is a very great thing, he continued, that will have to be dealt with at no distant date if the colonies are to continue to be colonies, for it will not be satisfactory to Canada that the present relations should continue in their present condition. Those relations must get looser or they must get stronger. It was a dilemma which, along the notion of reciprocal preference, the Imperial Conference of 1897 left implanted in Chamberlain's mind.